Welcome to the deep dive. All right, let's get into it. Today, we're unpacking a stack of sources you've shared with us, notes and articles covering two really significant documents in security and privacy, NIST SP 853 Revision 5 and ISO 27002.2022.
That's right.
Our mission, using only your material, is to cut through the complexity, pull out the key nuggets, and really understand what these specific documents are telling us about navigating this whole landscape of security and privacy controls.
Exactly. And it's important to stress, we're focused just on the excerpts and info you've provided, not the whole standards.
Right.
Your first source gives us a very tight focus on one area, from ISO 27002 authentication information. Then the second source, the NIST 853 R5 material, paints a broader picture, lays out some foundational ideas, and then dives into, well, quite a few detailed snippets across different control families.
So think of this as us guiding you through the specific set of papers you've got. We'll explore what these documents highlight, see where they might touch on similar ideas, maybe with different levels of detail based on your sources, and just distill the core concepts that are laid out right here in these papers.
Yeah, it's about getting those essential insights from your stack without, getting lost in the weeds of the full, enormous standards themselves.
So the plan is start with that ISO piece, then look at the NIST intro and context from your source. Then we'll do a bit of a compare and contrast on authentication based only on what's here.
And then we'll spend some time exploring the other specific NIST controls that are detailed in your snippets.
Right.
Sort of see what those examples tell us about NIST's approach in practice.
Sounds like a solid plan. Let's kick off with that first source. It's the ISO 27 Area 02.2022 excerpt Control 5.17, all about authentication information.
Okay, so this control, as it's presented in your source, it sets out a pretty fundamental requirement. Basically, how you allocate and manage authentication information, passwords, tokens, that sort of thing. It should be controlled by a formal management process.
A defined process. Makes sense.
Right, and a key part of that process, the document says, is making sure personnel are advised on how to handle this information properly. Basic security hygiene around credentials.
And the purpose stated in this snippet.
It's straightforward. Ensure proper entity authentication, making sure someone or something is who they claim to be, and preventing failures in those authentication processes, failures that could obviously lead to security breaches.
Got it. The source also includes some metadata.
Yeah, it does. It tags the control type, linking it to things like information security properties, cybersecurity concepts, operational capabilities, security domains, and it lists specific properties. Hashtag preventive, hashtag confidentiality, hashtag integrity, hashtag availability, hashtag protect, hashtag identity and access management, and hashtag protection.
So quite a few tags. Gives you a feel for where it fits.
It does. It's a high-level snapshot, really, of a critical area and its intended role within that ISO framework, based on this specific text.
Okay, let's pivot now to your second source, the excerpts from NIST SP 800 F53 Revision 5. This one seems to start with a wider lens, looking at information systems generally.
It does. The introduction you've got here, it talks about clear need to strengthen the systems, products, and services we rely on, especially with everything being so interconnected now. Cyber physical systems, cloud, mobile, ICS, IoT.
All the buzzwords, but they represent real complexity.
Exactly. And the stated goal here is to provide a comprehensive set of safeguards covering both security and privacy. That's a key point from the intro.
Security and privacy. So the objective described is pretty broad then.
Oh yeah. It's about making systems more penetration resistant, limiting damage if something does go wrong, achieving resilience, survivability, and explicitly protecting individual privacy. It frames the controls as protecting the organization's operations and assets, but also the privacy of individuals.
That dual focus seems important. What else does the NIST intro highlight in your source?
Several key ideas. One is that the controls themselves are kind of independent of the specific process you use to select them. You could use them within NIST's own RMF, or the cybersecurity framework, the privacy framework, or just general risk management.
Flexible in application, then.
Seems to be the idea. The source says the criteria for picking controls are driven by things like mission needs, threats, vulnerabilities, compliance rules, the usual suspects. The catalog is there to help organizations get to adequate security and privacy.
Protecting against threats and PII risks.
Right. Personally identifiable information. The source explicitly mentions protecting against privacy risks from processing PII. And it makes it clear. Organizations are on the hook for selecting the right controls, implementing them correctly, and then proving they actually work, demonstrating effectiveness.
Okay, responsibility lies with the organization.
Definitely. The source also mentions using controls for specialized baselines or overlays, basically, tailoring the standard set for specific system types or specific risks. And it brings up common controls.
Common controls.
Yeah, these are capabilities that one part of an organization might implement, and then multiple other systems or programs can just inherit them. It's efficient, but the source does flag a potential downside. It can create a single point of failure.
Makes sense. If that common control breaks, everyone inheriting it feels the pain.
Precisely. The source also mentions assurance-related controls. What's the deal there?
Right. The source notes these contribute to confidence that security or privacy claims are actually being met. It points to Appendix C, where a checkmark indicates this. These controls help define development activities, generate evidence about how the system works, and trace that evidence back, building confidence that requirements are satisfied.
Building confidence. Okay, and how do new controls get added to NIST, according to this source?
It says they come from analyzing new threats, vulnerabilities, adversary tactics, TTPs, risk mitigation ideas, new laws, new policies. It's described as a continuous process, balancing stability with being responsive to changes in tech, threats, attacks, adjusting the level of security and privacy over time.
Okay, dynamic, not static. Got it. So here's where it gets really interesting. Comparing, based just on your sources, we had that ISO 5.17 excerpt on managing authentication information.
Right, the high-level management process requirement.
Exactly. Now, let's look at how the NIST source you provided tackles similar ideas. Specifically within those identification and authentication, the IA family snippets.
Okay, yeah, how do they line up?
Well, the difference in the level of detail presented in your sources is pretty striking. The ISO excerpt gives us that high-level what and why. You need a process. You need to advise people. The goal is proper authentication, prevent failures.
A foundational principle, really.
Totally. Now look at the NIST IA excerpts you have. They immediately jump into the how and the specific types of requirements. For instance, your source shows IA3, device identification and authentication. This demands unique ID and authentication for specific devices before they can connect. Local, remote, network, doesn't matter.
Okay, much more specific.
And the discussion points in the source even mention potential technical approaches using MMAC or IP addresses for the ID part, or protocols like 802.1x, Radios Kerberos for the authentication part.
So ISO says manage the info. NIST IA3 in your source says authenticate the device and even suggests how. Big difference in granularity.
Huge difference. Then you've got IA10 in your source, adaptive authentication. This introduces the idea of needing extra authentication steps under certain conditions.
Like what?
Like if someone's accessing unusual amounts of data, or maybe logging in from a weird IP address. The source stresses this doesn't replace multi-factor authentication, but it augments it. Adds a dynamic layer based on context or risk.
Interesting. So it's not just about the initial login.
Right. It's about ongoing awareness. And then there's IA12 from your source, identity proofing. This is even more fundamental. It's not just authenticating a session. It's about establishing who the person is in the first place to a certain level of confidence before they even get an account.
Verifying identity before you give out credentials.
Exactly. The source talks about resolving identities to a unique individual, collecting identity evidence, validating it, verifying it.
Okay, so summing up the comparison based only on these source excerpts, ISO 5.17 gives that high-level directive have a management process for auth info. The NIST IA snippets, IA3, IA10, IA12, provide examples of the specific, actionable requirements an organization using NIST might implement related to authentication. Things like device auth methods, dynamic checks, identity proofing.
It's a clear difference in granularity presented in these particular documents. ISO sets this strategic goal. NIST, in these examples, provides the tactical and operational how-to.
Okay, that makes sense. Since your NIST source provides so much more detail across different areas, let's explore some of the other specific control snippets presented there. We can just move through them as they appear in your document and see the breadth of NIST's focus as shown here.
Sounds good. Let's start with the access control family, AC, as it appears in your source. These are all about, who gets access to what. And based on these snippets, NIST gets pretty specific.
Big how?
Well, you see things like requiring automatic inactivity logout, AC3.5, and dynamic privilege management, AC3.6, where access rights can actually change based on the situation or mission needs, not just static roles.
Beyond just setting permissions once.
Exactly. It also mentions the classic concepts, mandatory access control, AC3.3, and discretionary access control, AC3.4. But it goes further into controlling information flow. AC314 talks about using filters for data transfers, restricting things based on file size, character sets, schema validation.
Controlling the data itself as it moves.
Right. And the discussion notes highlight needing to ID and authenticate the source and destination for these transfers, linking back to those IA controls we talked about for forensics and making sure policy is followed.
So not just if you can access, but what you can do and how it moves.
Precisely. Your source also hits standard security requirements like least privilege, AC65, specifically for privileged accounts, restricting them to only necessary people and roles. It details requirements around unsuccessful logout attempts in AC9, things like lockouts or delays, and session termination in AC12, requiring user logout options and clear messages.
Seems very practical, down to the details.
Yeah. The AC snippets also touch on assigning security and privacy attributes. AC16.4, managing remote access, AC17, with specific config and authorization rules, and even dealing with external systems, AC20, stressing you need to verify controls on those external systems or have agreements in place before connecting.
Okay, that covers access control based on the snippets. Moving from systems to people, your NIST source includes bits from the Awareness and Training, or AT family.
Right. The key things highlighted in your document here are AT2, which specifically calls out training on spotting and reporting potential insider threats. That's quite specific.
Insider threats, yeah, that's a big one.
In AT3, role-based training. This requires training tailored to specific jobs before people get access or start their duties, and then refresher training periodically, plus updating the content regularly and after system changes or incidents.
So training isn't one size fits all, and it has to stay current. Makes sense. What about audit and accountability, the AU family?
Crucial for knowing what happened. AU3 in your source gets into the specific content of audit records needing timestamps, source IPs, user IDs, what happened, the outcome, files accessed, etc. It also explicitly notes the privacy risks if PII gets logged.
Good point. Got to be careful what you log.
Absolutely. AU5 deals with what happens if the audit logging itself fails, requiring alerts to the right people and predefined actions like maybe stopping the system or overwriting old logs. You need the logs to be reliable.
Protecting the logs themselves.
Exactly. AU71 discusses automatically processing audit logs to help sort and search for specific events based on different fields. And AU9 is about protecting the audit information using crypto like signed hashes, AU93, to ensure integrity, and restricting who can manage the logging system itself to a subset of privileged users, AU94. This acknowledges the risk of people tampering with their own logs.
Controls on the controls again.
Sure.
Shifting to the CA family assessments and authorization.
Yeah, the general discussion in your source emphasizes that assessing controls isn't just a one-off thing. It happens throughout the system development lifecycle, or SDLC.
The whole process of building and running a system.
Right, and it's part of ongoing continuous monitoring. The goal is to ensure requirements are met, find weaknesses, inform risk decisions. Your source also highlights specific assessment activities, monitoring for information disclosure on public websites, CAA2, managing system interconnections, CA6, through formal agreements like MOUs or SLAs.
Documenting those connections. Yes. And requiring independent assessments for continuous monitoring, CA10-1, to get an impartial view. It also mentions penetration testing and red team exercises, CA8 basically. Ethical hacking to simulate real attacks and test defenses, using the results to improve training and controls.
Proactive testing. Good stuff. Okay, configuration management, the CM family.
CM is all about establishing a secure baseline and managing changes carefully. CM1 requires formal policies and procedures. CM2 highlights using automation to help maintain the accuracy and currency of those baselines.
Using tools to keep track.
Exactly. CM3 outlines a systematic configuration change control process proposals, reviews, testing, approvals, often involving change advisory boards or CCBs. It specifically notes that if a change impacts privacy risk, you need to update relevant documents like privacy impact assessments, PIAs, or systems of records notices.
Those privacy documents again?
Yes. The snippets also mention reviewing changes for unauthorized modifications, CM37, verifying controls after a change, CM42, restricting who can make changes, CM5, and periodically reviewing systems to remove unnecessary functions, that's least functionality, CM71.
Getting rid of stuff you don't need.
Right, reduces the attack surface. CMA5 mandates a detailed system component inventory hardware, software, firmware with info like owners, versions, locations, and keeping it updated.
That inventory sounds foundational.
It really is. And finally, CM11 addresses user-installed software, having policies on what users can install, enforcing them, and monitoring compliance, distinguishing between okay things like approved updates and bad things like sketchy downloads.
Okay, let's talk contingency planning, CP. Preparing for when things go wrong.
The source snippets touch on a few things here. CP4 mentions requiring telecom providers to have their own contingency plans via enhancement CP84 and getting proof they test them. CP6 is about having alternate storage sites for backups with equivalent security and, importantly, geographically separate.
Don't put your backups next door to the primary.
Right. CP7 is similar, but for alternate processing sites having somewhere else to run operations if the main site is down. CP7.1 emphasizes that separation needs to be sufficient to avoid shared threats, like the same hurricane hitting both sites. And CP11 requires having alternate communications protocols ready just in case.
Planning for disruptions.
Yeah.
Good. We covered identification and authentication, IA, earlier in the comparison. Let's look at incident response, IR.
Okay, IR is about handling security incidents. IR 3.1, in your source, emphasizes using simulated events in training to practice crisis response. IR 6 is basic but crucial, requiring personnel to report suspected incidents promptly.
Getting that initial alert quickly.
Yes. IR 4.9 talks about having a dynamic response capability, being able to deploy new defenses or tools quickly during an incident. And IR 4.10 brings in the supply chain again. It requires coordinating incident handling with other organizations in the supply chain developers, vendors for incidents involving their products or services. Recognizing incidents can cross organizational boundaries. Lastly, IR 5.1 mentions using automated tools for tracking, collecting data, and analyzing incidents, like dedicated incident response centers.
Okay, MA is maintenance. What's highlighted there?
MA4 deals with non-local maintenance, think remote support. It requires strong replay-resistant authentication, like multi-factor PKI, keeping records, and terminating sessions when done. For classified systems, MA4.2 adds a strict requirement. Maintenance personnel must have the right clearances for the highest level of classification on that system.
Serious stuff for classified environments. Makes sense. MP, media protection.
This is about physical and digital media. MP3 requires marking media tapes, drives, whatever, with handling caveats and security markings. MP6 requires media sanitization before disposal, release, or reuse, using techniques strong enough for the sensitivity of the data that was on it, basically securely wiping media.
Don't just throw old hard drives in the bin. Got it. PE, physical and environmental protection.
Right, locks and guard stuff. PE2 covers physical access authorizations, maintaining lists of who's allowed in, issuing badges, reviewing the list, removing people when they leave. PE4 is about controlling physical access to network cables and distribution lines inside the facility. Think locked wiring closets, conduit to prevent tampering or tapping.
Protecting the wires themselves.
Yep. PE5.2 requires linking output from devices like printers or copiers to an individual's identity, maybe requiring authentication before a print job is released, so the wrong person doesn't grab sensitive documents.
Secure printing.
Exactly. PE6 mandates monitoring physical access guards, cameras, sensors, reviewing logs, and specifically monitoring access to sensitive areas like server rooms. PE6.4. PE10 requires having emergency shutoff capabilities for systems, and PE10.1 discusses having an alternate power supply. PE18 is about location positioning equipment to minimize risks from physical hazards like floods or unauthorized access like wireless sniffing. And PE22 requires marking hardware components to show their impact or classification level.
Covering all the physical bases. Okay, PL, planning.
PL8 focuses on security and privacy architectures. It emphasizes establishing that documented baseline configuration under change control, coordinating with security and privacy folks, and considering dependencies on external services. PL8.1 specifically calls out designing using defense in-depth layering controls effectively.
Defense in depth, yeah, a core concept. Now, PM, program management, this sounds like the overarching view.
Exactly. It's about managing the security and privacy program itself. PM1 requires a formal information security program plan. PM3 deals with getting the necessary resources budgeted. PM9 mandates a comprehensive risk management strategy covering both security and privacy risks to operations, assets, individuals, even the nation. It includes setting risk tolerance, planning mitigation, monitoring, and considering supply chain risk. PM30.
That strategy sounds critical. The source also mentions specific roles.
Yes. PM21 identifies the organizational privacy officer. PM26 requires disseminating privacy info, like posting clear privacy policies on websites and apps, keeping them updated. PM31 specifically requires assessing suppliers of critical items as part of supply chain risk management. PS8 mandates personnel screening before granting access. And PS7 deals with security requirements for external personnel like contractors.
Okay. PT is personal identifiable information processing and transparency, focused on PII.
Right. PT2 requires documenting the authority to process PII and restricting processing only to what's authorized. PT21 mentions data tagging, attaching tags to PII to track authorized uses. PT3 requires providing clear privacy notices to individuals explaining how their PII is used, the authority, purpose, choices, etc.
Transparency for the individual.
That's
Good. RA, risk assessment.
RA2 is security categorization, figuring out the potential impact if confidentiality, integrity, or availability is lost, documenting it, getting it approved. It notes privacy impact assessments help understand impact on individuals. RA31 focuses specifically on supply chain risk assessment, looking at risks from components or services, considering events like disruption, counterfeit parts, malicious development, and their impact on CIA, operations, assets, individuals.
Supply chain risks seem to pop up everywhere.
They're a major focus. RA5 covers vulnerability monitoring and scanning, finding flaws using various tools and techniques, analyzing results, fixing things based on risk, sharing findings. RE511 even suggests having a public disclosure program for vulnerabilities, a channel for researchers to report flaws responsibly.
Bug bounty style.
Sort of, yeah. RA6 mentions technical surveillance countermeasures, surveys sweeping for bugs or other technical security weaknesses, and RA8 mandates privacy impact assessments, PIAs, conducted early and kept updated, involving collaboration across teams.
SA, system and services acquisition. Buying or building systems securely.
That's the idea. SA8 requires applying security and privacy engineering principles throughout the process, things like layered protections, secure SDLC practices, threat modeling. SA813 mentions the principle of minimized security elements, keeping trusted components simple. SA819 talks about continuous protection, ensuring changes don't create insecure states.
And external services.
SA95 addresses restricting the processing, storage, and service location for external services based on requirements, noting how location impacts things like incident response and applicable laws. SA10 mentions developer configuration management. SA11 covers developer testing, including threat modeling, SA11.2, reusing vulnerability info from similar systems, SA11.8, and even formal methods to prove design consistency, SA11.3.
Getting deep into the development side. Okay, SC, system and communications protection, protecting data in transit and at rest.
Broadly, yes. SC22 suggests separating system and user data for privacy. SC3 requires isolating security functions from non-security ones, using partitions or domains, and SC33 aims to minimize non-security functionality within that security boundary to reduce risk. SC5 addresses denial of service protection.
SC7, boundary protection, sounds important.
Very. It requires monitoring and controlling traffic at external and key internal boundaries, often using firewalls, gateways, and DMZs. SE710 specifically targets preventing data exfiltration, using techniques like traffic analysis, DLP, or monitoring for command and control beaconing. SE721 adds isolating system components internally for better protection and flow control.
And protecting data on the wire.
That's SE8, transmission confidentiality and integrity. SE81 explicitly requires cryptographic protection like TLS or IPsec. SE18 deals with mobile code verifying it, preventing bad code, preventing auto-execution. SE21 requires secure DNS resolution. SE27 suggests platform-independent apps for portability. SE30 is interesting, concealment and misdirection, using techniques like virtualization to confuse attackers.
Hiding things from the bad guys.
Kind of. SE31 requires covert channel analysis to find hidden data paths. SE34 deals with integrity on read-only media. SE37.1 discusses protecting wireless links against intentional jamming using crypto. And SE43 requires usage restrictions on components.
Almost there. SI, system and information integrity.
SI4 is malicious code protection detection, eradication, reporting, scanning, quarantine. Discusses signature versus non-signature detection, false positives. SI413 is specific, detecting unauthorized OS commands on hardware. SI415 requires alerts based on system-generated indicators of compromise from logs or security tools. SI417 mandates monitoring wireless traffic for malicious activity. SI418 requires analyzing outbound traffic for covert exfiltration, like data hidden using steganography.
Finding hidden data leaving the network.
Exactly. SI7 is about software, firmware, and information integrity. SI7.3 suggests centrally managed integrity tools. SI7.5 discusses automated responses to integrity violations. SI7.12 requires verifying integrity of user-installed software before running it. SI10.6 focuses on preventing injection attacks during input validation. SI 12 covers information management and retention limiting PII elements collected, SI 12.1, and securely disposing of info, SI 12.3.
SI 13 is predictable failure prevention.
Yeah, figuring out mean time to failure for parts and having replacements or standbys ready. SI 18 is about PII, quality checking accuracy, relevance, timeliness, completeness, and correcting errors. SI 19.6 describes differential privacy, adding noise to data results to protect privacy while allowing analysis, noting the accuracy trade-off.
And finally, SR supply chain risk management.
SR 2.1 requires establishing provenance, unique IDs for supply chain elements, processes, personnel for better visibility and tracking. SR 4.1 discusses tamper resistance and detection, using methods like crypto hashes or tamper-evident seals to detect physical tampering, leveraging supplier processes and training staff.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a detailed journey through the NIST SP 853R5 excerpts you provided. We kicked off with that very focused look at authentication from the ISO source snippet.
Right, the management process requirement.
And then we just explored this wealth of detailed controls and concepts from the NIST snippets, covering everything from access control, physical security, configuration management, all the way through to privacy controls, incident response, and supply chain risk.
It really does highlight, based only on these specific documents you shared, how different standards can approach the same goals, security, privacy, but with vastly different levels of granularity.
Yeah, the ISO excerpt set that high-level requirement for authentication info management. But the NIST IA examples showed concrete technical steps, device auth, adaptive checks, identity proofing.
Exactly. And while your ISO source was laser-focused on that one control, the NIST excerpts demonstrated how that framework dives deep into specifics across pretty much every security and privacy domain imaginable. It gives you a real sense of the depth NIST offers to meet those broad objectives it laid out in the intro.
Hopefully, pulling these points together from your sources helps clarify the landscape these documents are working within. It gives you a tangible feel for the difference between, say, a high-level principle and very detailed implementation guidance based just on the papers you have here.
So what does this all really mean for you, the listener? Well, it might make you think about the level of detail you need when you're putting security and privacy safeguards in place. How do you actually translate a high-level goal into those specific actionable steps, like the ones we saw illustrated in many of those NIST controls?
That's a good question.
And maybe it raises a broader question to ponder. In this world where tech and threats just don't stand still, how do organizations make sure that the standards and controls they choose and implement, like the ones discussed here, actually remain effective and adaptable over time to genuinely protect their operations, their assets, and, crucially, individual privacy?
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for bringing these sources for us to deep dive into with you today.